Every individual, no matter whether they realize it or not, possesses inherent self-interests that are fueled by the principle of self-preservation. It's not difficult to understand why, because if you fail to take the adequate steps that facilitate your own self-preservation, then you'll eventually perish. To not only survive where basic needs are met, but also to thrive where you can partake in at least some pleasure and leisure, you must be selfish. Selfish enough to know what you want and selfish enough to implement the necessary steps which will manifest the particular outcomes you desire. Although this tends to be rather obvious, an underlying danger is hidden in the background like a predator in the night. While you're safe out in the woods huddled by the warmth, light, and protection of a campfire, the predator hides in the surrounding darkness, waiting for you to let your guard down and make a mistake. One bad move, and that's all this predator needs to strike. This analogy is rather apt for selfishness because although it may seem like a safe option, or the natural course of action, a hidden danger always persists. One bad move, otherwise known as drifting towards extreme selfishness, will lead to your downfall. Knowing this, a few evident questions arise. How selfish or unselfish should you be, and how fine is the line between selfishness and unselfishness? Further, can you successfully navigate this narrow tightrope where you walk the line between extreme selfishness and extreme unselfishness? Today's discussion attempts to answer these questions and provide some insight into the perennial debate between selfish and unselfish thoughts, actions, and motives. My principal assertion is that you must effectively discern when you should be more or less selfish, knowing when to pick your battles, but you should also be prepared to face the real-world consequences of your decisions no matter which course you take. Ultimately, drifting to either extreme is inadvisable, so your best bet is to remain close to the center where you aren't entirely selfish, but you also aren't unselfish to the point that you're akin to a doormat. To begin, this topic has been yet another source of long-standing rumination, and it was reignited by some comments I heard last weekend. I was watching the Canadian Open, one of the professional golf association's major tournaments, and one announcer made some key comments about a particular golfer. He mentioned that this golfer is, quote, one of the nicest guys around, but at this time he needs to be a little more selfish, end quote. The context of these comments appeared to be that even though he was in a comfortable position atop the leaderboard, this particular golfer, in the announcer's view, needed to be more selfish in order to achieve the ultimate goal of winning it all. I found these remarks intriguing because I already thought to myself, this golfer is certainly selfish to a considerable degree already because of the work he put in to get here. He is selfish enough, or at least possesses the courage, to fiercely protect his time and effort from distractions so he could continually hone his skills on the golf course. He was selfish and ambitious enough to pursue his goals of playing professional golf on the PGA Tour. How much more selfish does he have to, or should he have to be? Building off these comments, it's easy to wonder what actions and behaviors are classified as selfish or unselfish. Sometimes they seem relatively clear-cut, whereas on other occasions the distinction is murky. Before going further, a definition of terms is necessary. One definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines selfish as, quote, concerned excessively or exclusively with oneself, seeking or concentrating on one's own advantage, pleasure, or well-being without regard for others, end quote. Meanwhile, the Cambridge Dictionary defines unselfish as someone who, quote, thinks about what is good for other people, not just about their own advantage, end quote. It's readily apparent that selfish and unselfish are adjectives generally utilized to describe people, their motives, thoughts, and actions in particular. An individual is typically denoted as selfish if they fail to consider others when making decisions. Meanwhile, a person is generally regarded as unselfish if they not only consider other people when making decisions, but they also demonstrate great self-restraint by reining in their desires or ambitions. Seems obvious enough, but the problem is that there are more than a few examples in life where the distinction is blurred. Take for example a person working to earn a living, like we all must do in various ways to survive. Let's permit that the particular individual for this example is the owner of a company that provides a service, but this company's business practices are shady and profit is pursued above all else. Naturally fits the bill for total selfishness, right? Indeed, at first glance, but let's add another element to the example. Say also that this person came from a poverty-stricken family, and their motive for making as much money as possible is to make life better for their loved ones, to care for their sick and rapidly aging parents, and to ensure that the next generations, children and grandchildren, do not suffer comparable hardships. This makes classifying them as entirely self-absorbed more arduous because although they're being selfish by pursuing profit above all else, they're also ostensibly doing so for an entirely unselfish motive, which is to ensure that their loved ones are spared of further hardships and have a better upbringing, in the case of the younger generations. Someone who is completely unjust or selfish wouldn't sacrifice so much for others, even for their loved ones. I won't go into the ethics of this situation today, but my point is that the distinction between what constitutes selfish versus unselfish behavior isn't always so black and white. There are varying degrees, or nuances, of either characteristic, and it demonstrates how our subjective perceptions of circumstances influence our classification of behaviors. Context inevitably matters, and it always will, especially if we genuinely aspire to fully comprehend phenomena like this. Digressing, but still continuing somewhat with this train of thought, my personal experiences have evidently shaped my interpretations of selfish and unselfish behavior. When I was much younger, I was taught to be humble, and part of this humility was to reject selfish behaviors wherever possible. From childhood to midway through adolescence, I largely equated being nice with unselfishness, and this likely explains why I didn't stand up for myself as much as I should have. Another byproduct of this mentality was the significant restriction of both aggression and assertiveness. While remaining level-headed and composed is generally regarded as beneficial, you sometimes run the risk of being passive, and that's what happened when I was younger. I was essentially conditioned to be passive, to talk less, to listen more, and to follow direction from elders with little or no questioning throughout my home life because causing trouble, or metaphorically stirring the pot in any way, would elicit a negative reaction from my parents, my mother in particular. Whenever my siblings or I did something that displeased her in some manner, she would either be immensely disappointed or angry. Furthermore, we always knew which mood she was in due to her countenance and her remarkable ability to level harsh comments with no filter. One consequence of growing up in this environment was that I was generally passive elsewhere, keeping to myself and trying not to cause trouble because I wished to avoid further anger and animosity from others. It was already bad enough at home, and when you experience something extremely negative and/or painful, you don't want to suffer more of it. While this avoidant modus operandi dominated a large part of my childhood and early adolescence, I did retain some aggressive and assertive tendencies, particularly with athletics and academics. I realized how important these life dimensions were, and I fervently pursued my objectives. So, it appears that a prominent duality existed within me where I generally held a passive disposition, but on the flip side I was immensely assertive about some endeavors, like hockey. In recent years, as I've matured further into young adulthood, my disposition has shifted. While I still attempt to avoid unnecessary conflict, I no longer hold the mindset of avoiding it at all costs. Furthermore, I reject the notion that standing up for yourself and going after what you want is inherently selfish. I often think these days, if others pursue what they desire, then why can't I do the same? And is it wrong of me to go after what I want? The answer to the first question is why indeed, and the answer to the second question is a firm no, but there is a caveat I'll mention later. Through my collective experiences, I've realized that you must possess a degree of selfishness in order to acquire what you desire. A vital component of this notion isn't avoiding causing any harm, which I tried to do when I was younger, but rather it's realizing that causing some harm is necessary and inevitable. My younger self equated kindness with causing no harm, which evidently was fundamentally flawed. Flawed because although others might be harmed by your actions, some harms are necessary in order to facilitate a more constructive outcome. A common example of this idea is the emotional hurt that arises when you reject a potential love interest. If you possess no feelings for this person and you cannot foresee a relationship working out, then rejecting them becomes necessary for the betterment of everyone involved. While the rejected person might suffer for a time, it's better that outcome occur than to attempt a relationship which will be doomed from the start and likely cause greater harms in the future. Another common example of this phenomenon, of why certain harms are necessary and what can also be noted as the purpose behind the pain principle, is that of raising children. Disciplining them is not only ideal, but it's also essentially compulsory, because if you fail to properly guide them, then they'll be set up for failure and hardship in the future. While children will likely be hurt and offended by reasonable disciplinary actions, such as a good scolding, experiencing this momentary displeasure is nothing compared to the sufferings that can arise through insufficient readiness for life's challenges, and therefore, I've realized that it's necessary for me to be more selfish, to go after what I desire and to be less concerned about how my actions impact others, at least compared to how hyper-concerned I was at a younger age about not hurting or offending others. Evidently, I aim to be respectful, but I now possess the assertiveness to put others in their place when appropriate and to avoid being disrespected, taken advantage of, or treated like a doormat. Nevertheless, the balancing act still remains. But why is that? The answer, or the caveat which I was alluding to earlier, is because you must be strategic about how selfish or unselfish you decide to be. Going too far to one extreme or the other will lead to disaster. In my case, when I was younger, I went too far to the unselfish side, and this resulted in more suffering, disappointments, disrespect, and being treated as a doormat. Although you should avoid this direction, it's also inadvisable to go to the other extreme of complete selfishness. A brilliant illustration of the rationale behind this comes from Plato's Republic, Book 2, where Socrates is engaged in a debate with Thrasymachus regarding justice and injustice. The point of contention here is whether an unjust person is better off compared to a just person. Socrates evidently takes the position of justice being more profitable than injustice, and provides a compelling reason for it in the following passage. Quote, "We have shown that just people are cleverer and more capable of doing things, while unjust ones aren't even able to act together. For when we speak of a powerful achievement by unjust men acting together, what we say isn't altogether true. They would never have been able to keep their hands off each other if they were completely unjust, but clearly there must have been some sort of justice in them that at least prevented them from doing injustice among themselves at the same time as they were doing it to others. And it was this that enabled them to achieve what they did. When they started doing unjust things, they were only halfway corrupted by their injustice. For those who are all bad and completely unjust are incapable of accomplishing anything." End quote. This last part, of those who are completely unjust being incapable of accomplishing anything, is a vital insight because it's fundamentally true. If you decide to be entirely selfish in everything that you do, you'll bring more harm to yourself than good. Further, you'll be unable to cooperate with others and you'll act against your self-preservation instincts by making everyone an enemy. The paradox arises that pursuing your desires without restraint in the name of self-preservation will actually erode it altogether. I'll use anger because it demonstrates this point so well. Unsurprisingly, when you're immensely angry, the natural response would be to lash out at the source of your anger. This would fulfill the selfish, but typically damaging, desire to vent that anger and frustration. An example could be that you're driving on the road and a driver cuts you off, which causes you to swerve out of the way and narrowly get into an accident. Also natural would be the intense anger you experience towards the other driver, and one response could be to let them know what you really feel. If you choose to be completely selfish by allowing your anger to flow without restraint and you end up assaulting this other driver, then more harm will evidently arise. While you may momentarily experience gratification from getting back at the person who wronged you, your decision to selfishly acquiesce to anger has now costed you with legal ramifications. Fundamentally, the point is that it isn't in your self-interest to be entirely selfish, either in particular moments or in general. As Socrates points out, even when committing injustice, like a band of thieves stealing from others, there must be some justice and restraint, otherwise they wouldn't be able to function together. Pure selfishness, greed, injustice, evil, or whatever you want to call it, only leads to unbridled chaos. Hence, why you must reject extreme selfishness and walk the middle ground where you're selfish about certain parameters but unselfish with others. Of course, you can forgo this advice and choose to be selfish all the time and with everything. But if you do, then understand that the consequences will eventually catch up to you in one form or another. You can run from them, but you can't hide forever. Once again, this reminds me of the New International Version translation for Luke chapter 12, verses 2-3, which states, quote, "There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs." So, to close, How selfish or unselfish should you be? Ultimately, that is your call, and you must use your discernment to figure out when it's advisable to be one, the other, or both. Furthermore, like many situations, there isn't an exclusive dichotomy. You can be selfish about particular endeavors, but unselfish about others. Pursuing your goals and visions is selfish to a degree, but nobody usually bats an eye until they examine the means. If an individual pursues something honorably and justly, then they are commended, whereas if they utilize unjust, corrupt, or malevolent means to pursue their desires, then they are rightly condemned. Nevertheless, there's great nuance and subjectivity to this as well. It's difficult to accuse others of being selfish for pursuing what they desire, since all of us more than likely do the same, or will do the same at some juncture. Therefore, what truly separates selfish from unselfish comes down to the methods in which endeavors and achievements are pursued. What means will you utilize? Will you be pragmatic about how you pursue your ambitions and desires? Will you realize that there's some give and take, and that you must be unselfish during certain moments? Or will you let your greed fully consume you, to your own peril and to the peril of others?